think one of the things that I keep highlighting is the fact that for the next several years, the mobility network is the principal network on which all these transactions and information will be flowing. In other countries, there are options. As you pointed out, there's a satellite network, there's a cable network, there's a landline network, there's a mobility network, there are private networks, which all compete to carry information from various points to other various points. In India, we are single-threaded in terms of the mobility network being the most ubiquitous network and being the primary network which is relied on both by government and by private enterprise and consumers for transacting any type of activity, right? So when we look at M2M and IoT, this continues as the fundamental fact that we're dealing with. No question, but there are emerging alternatives. Cable is becoming important. I think the TRAI is pushing towards this. TRAI is also pushing satellite technology as an alternative network. So there are emerging alternative networks to carry this. Given the fact that it's mobility for the next several years, what is the principal issue we're seeing? So I don't think from the operator perspective there's any question but that the opportunities for the future lie in machine-to-machine, IoT, cloud computing, and any forum on this industry, you'll hear the same things. The question is how we're going to monetize this and the revenue stream attached to it. The revenue stream is important because presently when you look at the consolidation that has happened in the industry, apart from the one operator that appears to be making profits, the other two or three, which includes the PSU, BSNL, MTNL, continues to be in deep financial distress. And when you ask the outcome of that, the problem is that, of course, if you don't have the financial wherewithal, you're not going to be able to invest in the networks to provide the type of quality that is required for the end consumer to enjoy all of these phenomenal vision that you're putting out there for IoT and M2M. So why is it that we constantly go back to the government and saying, please help us to fix the financial issues? Most people will say, look, it's private, it's an industry, you guys created your own problems, solve your own problems. Well, part of the issue of government intervention is the government today takes over 30% of every rupee we earn right off the top. And that is not a sustainable proposition for the industry in terms of the investments that require to be made in network infrastructure to carry the types of applications and use cases that we're talking about. Why did this anomaly arise? Two things. One is that we moved to an auction-based acquisition of spectrum, and two, we continued with some legacy issues. Now, just to clarify, what happened was that before 2010, 2012, spectrum was bundled with your license. You didn't pay separately, and you were on a quote-unquote revenue share model. That is, you paid as you went. So funding was not an issue, debt levels were not an issue, you were generating your own working capital and your own investing, and so the industry was doing very well. Come 2012, the Supreme Court orders all licenses that were issued in a certain period of time to be cancelled and to move to an auction-based allocation and pricing methodology. Let me clarify, the industry supports auctions as the appropriate transparent means of allocating spectrum, not a question. It is the pricing of the spectrum that we become concerned about. For one thing, in the earlier parts, what caused this phenomenal run-up in terms of the pricing of spectrum was because spectrum quantum was constrained. Because spectrum quantum was constrained, operators, of which there were at one point 13, bid up the price of spectrum to unsustainable levels. And we are living with a legacy of that. Once spectrum quantum was increased, what you saw was operators walking away from spectrum auctions. You'll notice that in the last 700 megahertz spectrum auction, there were no takers. And there was excess spectrum that was left on the table in several bands. So we've moved, fortunately, from a spectrum-starved issue to a spectrum surplus issue. The fact that still remains is that we still haven't resolved the issue of spectrum pricing. And if you look today, we pay a 30% premium on the same spectrum that is used globally and paid for by other global operators. So I think that's why we have to go back to the government and saying is that, look, this funding of this, which is now debt-based because you pay upfront for auction spectrum, has become a substantial burden on the industry. What's the second point? You had the legacy issue of revenue share, which was supposed to go away when you paid for spectrum upfront, right? Unfortunately, that continues. So today, operators, in addition to having paid for the spectrum upfront, continue to pay 8% license fee and another 5% as spectrum usage charge. It's about 13 to 15%, all right? So this is why we're saying is that you can't have a double dip into your revenue stream. Charge me upfront for the spectrum, give it to me and let me use it, and don't then continue to take out additional levies that are on the industry. Now, let me also now talk about this additional vision of the government which has to be changed. When you look at GST introduction, GST introduction was introduced at 18% for the industry. We were at 15% in terms of service taxes. When this got changed, it got moved up to 18%. Okay? What else happened? The grant of spectrum was all of a sudden defined as a service on which you can charge GST. So every time I got a bill from the government saying, here's how much you just bid for spectrum that you've already paid for, right, over 50,000 crore rupees, I'm going to charge you 18% GST on this amount. Why? Because now I'm classifying this notice and grant of spectrum to you as a service. Every time I get a bill from the government saying, here's how much you owe me for license fee, there's 18% on the license fee. Every time you send me a bill for spectrum usage charge, which is on average about 5%, you charge me 18%. Now, this is not a sustainable way of handling it. That is why we say the government has to fix the whole issue of levies on the industry, free up the industry to start generating adequate cash flows to invest in the networks. If we do this, I think all of the realities that we are talking about will happen. So this is one of the critical points we've been highlighting to the government and continue to agitate with the government, and we're hoping that ultimately the government will take notice. Fortunately, when you look at NTPC, the National Digital Policy of 2018, the government recognizes this. We're waiting to see how soon can you begin to implement this rollback of all of these what we call double dip, double taxation issues, and helping the industry get back on its feet financially so that we can move forward in investing in the areas we desperately need for enhancing 4G quality today, rollout of 4G, and moving forward into the 5G space. Thanks.